happy to be here. I apologize that there are no slides or any fancy technology. I got this invitation right before we went into Treatum, and I didn't want to spend my Easter weekend working on technological things. So I will be talking, and then I spoke with Stefano, and I will get to him a list of resources so that after I talk, there's some resources that you can follow up with as needed. And in trying to think about what to speak about today, really the type of therapy that I do, I would say, is very practical, right? I want people to walk away from the very first session of counseling feeling like I have something I can do to make things a little bit better, something I can work on. So I wanted to come in with really practical things that you could do to help yourself, to help your loved ones, to kind of be in the best place possible in terms of mental health, and then kind of talk about like, how do you know when it's time to maybe see a counselor, right? When do you get some extra support? The beautiful thing is that we have, life has challenges. As Father said, we don't know what we're going to go through, right? We don't, we may have been through stuff in the past. We may be going through something now. We might go through something in the future. So there's no shame in using the resources available. I find very often that the mental health field will have a new trend or a new discovery. And often that new discovery is like, oh, prayer and meditation would be helpful for your mental health. And I always laugh like, oh, that thing we've been doing for 2,000 years in the church, right? Like a lot of times the things that they discover are things that are already part of our faith. They are already things that we are encouraged to do by our faith. Sometimes the way they're presented are with the removal of the faith part. But I'm here looking at how can we integrate all these things together. What does science have to say? What does our faith have to say? And truthfully, sometimes just some good old-fashioned common sense adages that we use in life. The things people used to say all the time, maybe our grandparents, great-grandparents, sometimes there's great wisdom in those things. We look at them as kind of corny or old-fashioned sometimes, but they're actually not. Sometimes there's things that are just really helpful. So what I'm hoping to do today is just give you a simple framework to think about your own mental wellness, the mental wellness of those you love. So I use the word faith. So F stands for fundamentals, A stands for attachment, I stands for individuality, T stands for thoughts, and then H stands for help. So I'm just going to go through each of those and talk a little bit about it. Let me just ask you, when you hear the word, this is a very popular word in the world. When you hear the word self-care, what do you think of?
Bottle of whiskey.
A bottle of whiskey, okay. That's not uncommon. That's not uncommon. What else do you think of? Or what do you think people think of when they hear the phrase self-care? Sleep, yes. Meditation. Exercise. Often when I use the phrase self-care, what is the first thing ladies say? Manicure. I don't have time to go get a manicure and a pedicure, right? Or go to the spa for a massage. Sometimes men will say, oh, I don't have a boat to go fishing. They think about toys or big things that they can do. So Mark was right on the nose. When we look at self-care, the myths are those expensive, fancy things that we have to do to take care of ourselves. But it's really about the fundamentals. That's why I use that word, the very basics. So let's talk about the one Mark said, sleep. What do you guys know? There's a lot of information out about sleep. In fact, one of the books that I'll put on the resource book, there's a fabulous book called Why We Sleep. If you read it, you will be inspired. You will also be terrified. You will think back and go, what did I do to myself in my 20s? Because you will learn how important sleep is. And in our world today, everything competes with sleep, right? We have electricity, so we can stay up as late as we want. There's 8 billion channels to flip through if you want to watch something. There's technology like our phones, games. What are the other things you think interfere with people's sleep? Music. Absolutely. Anything that's stimulating, right? In that way. We have to be careful with that. So and this is where those old adages come in. Okay, so here's one that people used to say, maybe your parents said to you, sleep on it, it'll be better in the morning, right? Our thoughts sometimes late at night are not the clearest, are not the most focused, are not the most helpful. So we really, when someone comes into therapy, most therapists are going to look at, how are you sleeping? How much are you sleeping? What's going on with your sleep? Like, we're looking at some basic self-care, right? And trying to assess and help people with some basic self-care. You said exercise, which is another one, absolutely. So I know the speaker that came before I watched the video online that did the introduction to mental health stuff. She talked about two things that we know are very helpful with exercise. If you can, you get outside. Okay, sunshine is great for you. And you, if possible, you get in a green space. You guys have some beautiful green space outside here, but there is something that happens to us. There's even research that shows if people just look at a picture of mountains or something green, trees, they mentally feel better. It helps with our mindset. I'm going to have you guys take a wild guess. How many steps per day do you need to take to prevent depression? Everybody's into counting their steps, right? They have their watch or their Fitbit, whatever they have on. How many steps per day? 7,000. 7,000. Any other guesses? 10,000.
3,245.
I love it. I love the specific. 30. Yeah. 5,642. They've actually quantified it. Okay? 5,642. That's how many steps to reduce depression. I think it's great for two reasons. One, because there's this arbitrary number of 10,000 steps that they've set, right? And sometimes the reality is, for my job, I sit. If I'm seeing 5-6 clients, I sit all day. Sometimes getting 10,000 steps when I've been sitting for hours is really hard. But I can get 5,642. The average person actually takes, they did a survey worldwide. So people in America, it's just under 5,000. And worldwide, it was just a little over 5,000. But most people the average did not meet the threshold of 5,642. So if you have a number in your head, try to get 5,642. They know it helps. It's a helpful piece of information. That's right. The other thing that's interesting is they have done some studies where they had some people take medication for depression or anxiety. They had some people take a walk. Same results. Okay, I'm not saying medication can't be helpful or useful sometimes, but a lot of times I don't meet with someone, the first thing I say is you should probably go talk to a psychiatrist or your doctor. I usually talk about how are you sleeping? Are you getting some exercise? Are you taking care of yourself? Nutrition we know is helpful, right? So eating foods that fuel us for things, for our body. With sleep, we know if you stop eating 3 hours before bedtime, you actually sleep much better because your body's done digesting and doing those things. Even the wisdom of our church, the newest thing I would say in the nutrition mental health field that's been very hot and popular is fasting, right? If you guys see, it's out there, intermittent fasting, all these different things. What has the church been doing for thousands and thousands of years? Fasting, right? There's great wisdom in the church and living out what the church teaches. I will say there's some interesting new theories coming out. They realized that maybe antidepressants didn't go straight to the brain and fix things in the brain. They actually think that antidepressants do something in the gut microbiome and actually shift that, and that's what lifts depression. They actually think it does something there. And there's some new research coming out, new theories that a lot of mental health issues might be microbiome related. It's very early in terms of research, but there's some really interesting things showing that if we actually just learn how to take care of ourselves well, we can probably keep a lot of mental health issues at bay. Human connection. What did you guys see when COVID happened? How did you feel during COVID? What did you see with regard to human connection? Broken. Yeah. How did you see?
I mean, I have 11 kids, so it's an easy task not to be able to, since we homeschooled for
Right.
the last 40 years, we had a lot better situation.
Yeah.
So many people with the masks, you had kids just all of a sudden now discovered their teacher at the end of the year or their parents. The communication breakdown and all, it was a disaster.
Absolutely. Don't you remember? I remember one of the first times walking through the grocery store after we had been completely at home for a couple weeks, right? You're walking through the grocery store and I'm laughing because I'm thinking we're all acting like you come around the corner and there's a person, it's like, oh, it's like everybody's a ghost and we're terrified of them. Many people, myself included, I don't necessarily deal with a lot of anxiety, but when we first started coming back to church, a lot of people had to manage the anxiety, be like, I'm sitting close to people and people are dangerous, like these messages we got. With the way things were handled, were really destructive. We know people with human connection, people that have relationships, people have better mental health, people that have connection. In fact, I remember maybe like a month or two into COVID, one of my good friends who was single and like at home by herself with her cat the whole entire time, came over and stood in my backyard and was just weeping because she was with another person. How destructive is that to us, right? I mean, solitary isolation, solitary confinement is a way to punish prisoners, and many people experience that during the lockdowns, and sometimes inadvertently when mental health stuff is going on, people experience it, right? A depressed person will have a hard time getting up and going out and interacting with others, so it's kind of self-reinforcing. Routine, healthy habits, having structure and things to manage things like technology, managing your home. Like these things we know are good for us. They are also excellent for your children. Things like routine, it's what I would say is my hope is that some of this talk you will go, oh good, I'm doing some of the right things. Right? Like for those of you who have children, you have bedtimes, you have routines, you have bath time. You do these things, you have these routines that you do with your children. That creates structure, security. So don't minimize those really healthy things that we do. The last thing I would say, well, really is the first thing, but our religious practices, right? Praying, going to adoration, going to Mass, meditating in the context of the church. It's not about emptying your mind and thinking about nothing. Meditating on good things, meditating on the Lord, meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary. When we as counselors assess for suicide risk, religious practice is called a protective factor. Okay? If someone attends church and they practice a faith, they are much less likely to try to take their life. That's considered a protective factor. In fact, there was a study done where they found one group of people had zero risk of suicide. Practicing Catholic adult women. The risk of suicide in this study that they did was 0% for women who faithfully practice their faith. There's great power in having a connection to something larger than yourself, having things rightly ordered, where God is the center of everything and everything comes out of that. There's great power in that. The other thing is when you are practicing your faith, you have human connection, right? You're part of a religious community. You have people who care about you and take care of you, and then you just have stability. There's something, again, about that routine and stability that is very good for our mental health. So those are, I probably missed little nuances in the fundamentals, but those are some of the fundamentals that you really want to look at for yourself, but also, how many of you are raising children or have grandchildren or people, anyone who has kids in their lives, right? These are the kind of things you want to be thinking about. How do we create this stable environment for these kids? And that will actually lead me into the second part, which is attachment. So for those of you that are raising kids or grandkids, we want them to grow up to be secure, mentally well, stable, right? You want them to have these tools to cope with life. You want them to be able to engage in healthy relationships and stay out of unhealthy relationships, right? So you want them to be in good things, but you want your kids to be able to recognize something that's not good and avoid that danger, relationship-wise. For those of you guys who work with clients, you know that very often when someone has experienced a lot of abuse or trauma in their life, I've had clients say to me I feel like there's something about me that attracts this stuff, right? They've had experiences and things shaped in their life that actually sometimes draw them to not recognize signs of danger in relationship, to not recognize that someone might not be a safe person. They have difficulty recognizing that. So we, in the counseling field, talk about attachment, because if attachment is done well, then we are able to recognize the signs of danger more effectively and regulate and understand how to avoid those things. So attachment theory, which is a theory within the counseling field, really looks at how our experiences with our caregivers as children impact our sense of self and how we can expect others to respond to us. So I'm going to go through this. Sometimes they say there's 4 kinds of attachment, some say 3, but I'm going to keep it really simple for us. We're just going to do 3 today. So secure attachment. Secure people assume that they are worthy of love and that others can be trusted to give it to them. This belief comes from an unconscious template that trickles into all their relationships, leading them to give others the benefit of the doubt, to open up, to ask for what they need, to support others. They assume other people like them, and they achieve intimacy. Okay, so they walk out into the world assuming if I go up and say, "Hi, Mike, my name's Wendy," I assume that Mike's going to shake my hand, he's going to be happy to meet me, and I'm going to have something to offer to him, and he's going to have something to offer to me. Okay, we just walk into the world in a different place when we have secure attachment. We assume that people are interested in us, and we are interested in other people. People that don't have secure attachment have a lot of things going on in their head when they're interacting with other people. They are not necessarily feeling like, if I go say hi to Mike, he'll be interested and happy to meet me. They might be like, I could go talk to Mike, but I don't know. He might think I'm weird for going up and saying hi to him, and he'll probably just ignore me like most people do, right? There's all this stuff going on when there's insecure attachment. So anxious attachment is people that assume others will abandon them, right? Their experience has been that when they need something from a caregiver, that caregiver is not able to respond to them. And I want to say that sometimes it's intentional in the sense that someone's parent is neglectful or abusive in some ways. Sometimes it's intentional. When I first became a counselor years ago, I worked with a teenager that her dad was killed in a car accident, I think a month after she was born. Her mom for the next year was a mess, right? Here she was with the newborn, and her dad had just, her husband had just been killed in an accident. She wasn't available to her daughter, not out of any kind of purposeful neglect or abuse. She was just a grieving mom who was a mess and wasn't very available to her kid. Didn't necessarily respond when her kid needed a response. And so her kid had some attachment issues, right? It wasn't intentional, it wasn't on purpose. Anxiously attached people will assume that others will abandon them. To keep themselves from being abandoned, they either act really clingy or they're like, whatever you want is okay. They will sacrifice everything. Oh, okay, you'd rather eat there? Okay. Small things like that to big things, right? Okay, you want to do this to me? All right, I'm not going to say no because I don't want to lose you. They'll accommodate everything. They will often plunge into intimacy too rapidly. They're like, I just met you, you're my best friend. I'm being a little facetious and exaggerating, but there's not the proper kind of understanding of how to connect, and with the anxiety of that attachment, there's not an ability to patiently wait for things to fruit out because the anxiety, the nervousness, those things are just going in their head nonstop. Then we have the flip side of anxious attachment, which is what we call avoidance. So anxious is, come here, come here, come here. Avoidant is like, I don't really need you. I don't. They are also worried about people abandoning them, but their reaction is instead of clinging, they're like, let me just keep you at arm's length, right? I'm not going to be too vulnerable. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to ask things. Intimacy signals to them like, I'm at a risk of being hurt, so they will avoid it. They will keep it at a distance. They will sometimes end things prematurely in relationships because they're too scared of being abandoned. I'll give you a couple examples. So here's an example of anxious attachment. This person shared with me, I couldn't understand my coworker. I just couldn't understand them. They had a dead battery on their car, and they just said, okay, I guess I'll just write some of my notes while I'm waiting for the AAA guy to come out. And they sat at their desk and wrote notes while they were waiting. And she said, I would have been like up at the window every 2 seconds looking to see if the AAA guy was here. I wouldn't have been able to focus and write notes. That's anxious attachment, right? I can't trust that someone's going to show up when I'm in need. I can't trust that they'll be there for me. I can't trust that they'll respond to my asking for something that I need. And so I'm going to do all these things that are like worry, try to hurry up and make it happen, cling, grip, versus I've had clients say this to me before. Well, they didn't text me back after I text them, and it was so rude. Like, I'm just like, well, screw you. I'm done with you, right? That might be an example of avoidant attachment. It's like, you just didn't even respond to this basic thing, so forget you, okay? And I'm not,
It was 2 seconds before,
right. Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's a burden for the people who suffer from that, right? Because they struggle in their relationships. So, for those of you that have kids, I'm going to give you the key to how you don't have to be perfect parents. Here's what you want to do. You want to respond to your kids when they express need. Your kid cries, pick up your kid, hug your kid, love your kid, right? I'm not saying, sometimes people hear this and they think, I'm supposed to coddle the kid and never let them deal with their consequences. No, of course not, right? It doesn't mean we run every second, but we're paying attention. We're responding to their needs, to their emotions. It helps them learn to trust that others will be them for them. This builds the healthy foundation of attachment. Nurturing, you're going to nurture them. Okay, when they're babies, you're going to cuddle them, you're going to rock them. One of the reasons that breastfeeding is so powerful is because what's happening? The mom is holding the baby here, and I guess there's two options. The mom is looking into this baby's eyes, and the baby's gazing back to her, or mom is scrolling on her phone, right? And again, I'm not saying that it's, every single time. There might be a time when you actually need to look at something on your phone, but that creates intimacy and connection, a sense like, this person is responsive to my need. Okay, as kids get older, you're going to read books with them. You're going to give them kisses. You're going to tickle them. You're going to say, I love you. You're going to make eye contact. You're going to hold them. For young children in particular, sometimes when kids are out of control of themselves, because they don't have the regulation that hopefully we as adults have, so they can cry and tantrum and do all those things. A lot of times when kids are really young, they need us physically to help them regulate that. So a kid's having a tantrum, instead of just saying, go to the corner until you can calm down, we might instead say, I'm going to help you calm down. And we actually would hold them and use our body to physically regulate what's happening in their body. The crazy thing is there's all these things that are going on there. We're lending them our self-control in those moments to help them get control of themselves. There's all kinds of research showing that the hormones and the pheromones we emit actually help with that. So boys that grow up without a father in the home, They get a bad rap sometimes, like there's not a father there to hammer down on them and control them. But here's the thing. When a male lives in the home, particularly a biologically related male to you, that man's testosterone regulates the testosterone of his teenage son. That man's testosterone helps the teenage son's testosterone not go wildly out of control. And for any of you who have teens or preteens, you know the hormones are sometimes wild, right? They're all over the place. And so our physical bodies, this is theology of the body in action, our physical bodies matter. Our physical bodies assist our children in being able to learn how to manage themselves and their behaviors and their emotions. As kids get older, right, you're going to take the time to talk with them, take interest in their lives, hear about their dreams and hopes. These are the kind of things that create a secure attachment, to know I matter to you. And what I would say, if you don't have children in your life right now, in terms of your home life, right, you still interact with children at church, out in the community, extended family members, right? You have places to offer that. I can remember way back when, years ago, last century, when my grandfather passed away, my cousin was about 10. And he didn't know how to manage the emotions. My grandpa was really more like his dad than his grandfather, so he was kind of a mess. And I remember that we were in my grandmother's condo, and he was standing at the door, opening and closing the door, just doing things that, of course, many of the other adults found really annoying because they're grieving. We've just come from the funeral. And instead of anyone going over initially to talk to him, they just stop doing that. They're yelling at him. It's like, I finally stood up and went over and was like, let me hang out with my cousin here a little, because he just couldn't regulate himself, right? He just was struggling to manage that. But kids, if we can help kids when they're in those places, that's where secure attachment develops. Is it making some sense for you guys as I'm saying it? Okay. Attachment issues can create difficulty in relationship, especially in marriage. And what I would say is, if you're dealing with this, or if there's someone in your life dealing with this, it's not that you're forever doomed. If you grew up in a household where you didn't get a secure attachment, you're not doomed. You can still have a good relationship. You can still be okay. But it can be helpful to work with someone who understands attachment. If you're having trouble in your marriage because of attachment stuff, so you could imagine if someone who's anxiously attached marries someone who's avoidantly attached, right? So the anxious person is clinging, and the avoidant person's like, stay away from me, why are you so needy, blah, 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 right? When those things are happening, it can create a lot of difficulty and conflict. So what I would say is there are counselors that are trained, there are marriage counselors that are trained in specific things that help with that. So that's something that you can always keep in mind. And we get healed through our very relationships, right? We get healed through our relationship with God, and we get healed through our relationship with each other when we experience things different than the narrative in our head. Okay? All right, we're going to move on to I, individuality. Okay, there is great value in knowing about yourself, your spouse, and your kid's personality. God knows each of us individually, okay? He knows the charisms, the talents, he knows our preferences. These are things that he's often given us as part of who we are, our individuality. He also knows our weaknesses, he knows what we could do better, but he responds to us individually, right? I think I had in my bio, I totally geek out on theology of the body. I love theology of the body. And I love every time Christopher West talks about, well, God will speak to you individually, right? If you guys have seen him speak before, he always bursts out in a song, right? So for him, God speaks to him in song. God speaks to him through music. In fact, I've even had that happen to me. It doesn't happen like it does to him all the time, but when I was in graduate school, long story short, I was working a lot of hours, doing my internship, going to school, holding a job, full-time job, So I went once a week staying awake 24 hours straight. That's when I say that sleep book will terrify you, because I realized, what did I do to myself in that year? But I would go to work after school at night and stay awake all night, and then switch to like sleeping in the day, and it was crazy. But I got to like where I was about a month from finishing grad school, and I was driving in my car, and I was like, Lord, I can't do this. I'm like, I can't do this anymore, Lord, I'm so tired. And literally on my radio comes this song, ooh, child, things are gonna get easy. And I'm like, okay, I can hang on just a little longer, Lord. I got it, right? He really spoke to me through that, which is, it's silly, but I received the message from God, like, hang on, you're okay. You're okay, you can do this, right? There are times that those things happen. So God works with us individually, and it's good to know individually who you are. Let's see how many people know. How many of you know if you're an introvert or an extrovert? Okay. How many of you guys are introverts? Okay. How many of you guys are extroverts? You know you are. Okay. That's really important to know. That's probably the most common personality thing we talk about, right? Why is it important to know? To regulate it. If you're introverted and you're like, I'm going to be out every night this week at a social gathering, and I'm going to interact with tons of strangers, you will be wiped out and exhausted, right? You will be overwhelmed. Now, if you're an extrovert like me, the more people I get to talk to, the more energized I am, right? That's how it works for me. But that's important for me to know. Because when I work in private practice and sit in an office by myself, what happens? My energy, right? I've got to make sure I have some social interactions and connections. Yes?
Is there such thing as an introvert, extrovert?
It's called an ambivert, and yes, there is. So they would say that what I would say is the whole thing is a continuum or a spectrum, right? So there's very extroverted people, there's very introverted people, there's a lot of people in the middle, and there are some people that in different seasons of life can kind of move beyond that middle one. But it's important to pay attention to. And the reason it's so important for us to know, so that's just one, but I have a niece who's introverted, and I kind of figured this out after watching her interact. And so when she was probably about 11, we were at a family gathering, and I was sitting with a couple other people, so I started talking about the difference between introversion and extroversion and doing it. And my niece was like, that's me, I'm not the famous person who talks to everybody, that's me. And she felt really validated. Lots of people, I would say, when people don't know this about themselves, some introverts will come into my office and think, what's wrong with me? Why am I so worn out by interacting with people? There's something wrong with me. Right? Truthfully, having done counseling for 25, 30 years, there's a portion of what I do that's just telling people, that's normal. Lots of people deal with that. Lots of people feel that way, right? People think they're the only one sometimes, especially if they don't have any knowledge about some of this stuff. So there's other things that it can be helpful to know. Your love language, probably many of you have heard of the 5 love languages. It's really helpful to know, am I a physical touch person? Am I a words of affirmation person? It's really helpful to know that about your spouse and your children. If you know what their love language is, you can actually speak their love language, right? I sometimes like to jokingly say, because I'm a convert from being a very active Protestant, I like to say I'm bilingual, right? I can speak Catholic and Protestant. And that's even one of the reasons, like, on my website, I kind of leave it that I'm a general Christian. I talk about being able to work with Catholics and Christians, but I leave it open because I'm happy to work with people who are people of faith, wherever they're coming from as a starting point. There's gender differences, no shocker to anyone in this room, despite what the world would like to tell us that there's no differences in gender. There's gender differences, right?
Yes, I was a man trapped in a woman's body.
Well, yes, then let me give you my card. Okay.
Well, I don't need it. 9 months later, my mom had me. So.
What I would say is understanding those, right? So sometimes I literally walk over to my bookshelf in the office, I pick up a book and I'm like, please order this online. Get this book and read it, right? There are things, and I can tell you there's one book, I'll put it on the resource list. There's a series of books by a Christian researcher. The book for women is called For Women Only. The book for men is called For Men Only. And what she did is she went out and she researched, asking thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women, what are the top 10 things you wish your wife or your husband knew about you? And then she funneled it all down and took the top 10 things and put it in a book, right? So here's the 10 things women want their husbands to know. I can tell you this, every time I've recommended the book to a guy, and they've gone out and got it and read it, they're like, really? Really, Wendy? And I'm like, really? Yes, it's accurate. And I've had men say, oh, what she says about men is totally accurate, right? There are major differences. And of course, that's a place that the enemy likes to poke, right? Of course. But there are major differences. There's also something, I'm not going to go into in here, but if you like things like personality theory, there's something called the 4 tendencies that many people find helpful to understand. It's kind of how we respond to expectations, habits, what are the things we might struggle with or not struggle with. So that's something, I'll include it on the resource list that comes out to you. But that's something that might be of interest if you like that kind of stuff. Let me talk a little bit about kids. It's helpful to understand just developmental stages. This is part of understanding differences, right? So, well, let me start by asking this. How many of you, when you were a teenager, could sleep till noon? Okay, most of us. Okay, how many of you could sleep till noon now? Stefano's the only one. He's still nice and young, right? So we do know biologically something happens with teenagers with their hormones that shifts their whole circadian rhythm. And I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation where they're like, I don't know what's wrong with them. They're so lazy. They sleep till noon every weekend. What's going on? Even some of my good friends who had the sweetest daughter you could ever want to have, I don't know what's wrong with her. She sleeps so late. I'm like, it's just biology. Relax, right? It will change. You make some adjustment of things. Of course, I'm not telling you, let your kids stay up till 3 a.m. playing video games, right? It doesn't mean you just let them do whatever they want and not still manage technology in some things. But it is just, sometimes here's what I've said to parents. Telling your kid whose natural clock is now set to where they're not going to even get sleepy till 11 or 12 at night, that would be like me telling you, okay, well, I want you to lay down at 4 p.m. for bedtime and go to sleep. Right? It's just not going to happen. But it's just helpful to understand those things, right? There's some developmental things that happen along the way. It's helpful to understand. I used to work at a group home for teen moms. A lot of them would get so frustrated when their 2-year-old would start saying, no, 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 right? That is developmentally an appropriate thing. The kid is figuring out I'm a separate person from you, and I have some will of my own. Now, it's annoying, sure, but it's developmentally actually appropriate. What I often say to people is before we go and diagnose anything in a teenager and a kid, I want to ask, is this developmentally an appropriate thing, right? Are they doing a developmentally appropriate action, behavior, attitude, thoughts? Then we're going to look at, is it individuality, right? I often ask people this question in sessions, is this new behavior or have they always done this? And then they're like, oh yeah, they've done that their whole life. Or they've done that our whole marriage. Okay, it's not new behavior, it's something that's been happening. This might be part of their personality, who they are, their style. And then we say, is there some diagnostic stuff here, right? But let's first make sure it's not just normal developmentally or just an individual part of who that person is. And I would say if, for those of you that know a little bit about yourselves or others, it could really help to know if your kids are introverted or extroverted. Introverted kids need really long on-ramps to head to things, right? You don't want to be like, we're running around doing our errands and now I'm going to drop you off at the birthday party that's already in session. That's terrible for an introverted kid, right? An introverted kid, you bring them early, you let them assess the lay of the land, you let them pick their seat where they want to sit, you give them some time to gear up. Okay, that's really helpful for people to keep in mind when they're trying to support their kids and their well-being. Throwing an introverted kid right into a social setting, and especially, I don't think anyone in this room, but if you're like, knock it off when they're upset, that's not helpful. Okay? Any questions about any of that? It's worth learning a little bit about yourself and those you love if you haven't done that already.
I've got 8 kids.
Yes.
Any, and they're all 14 and under, is there any, truth or something to be said for if you know that's their bent, then to constantly throw them the other way because you're trying to get them more to the middle, so to speak? So meaning, I have a couple kids that are introverted, and as much as possible, I'm like, we're going out, we're gonna be late to the party, you're gonna walk in there and have a great time, not because I'm trying to just throw them in the fire.
Right.
I do, what is it called, you front load them, I talk through the situation with them or whatever, but in my extroverted kids, it's well, let's sit down and take some quiet time and
Right.
Right. So is there any, yes, you need to know the tendency, you don't want to, disrupt their natural tendency, but don't you want to bend it back all towards the middle, on both sides?
Yes, great question. So 2 things I would say. One is, generally speaking, most often as we become adults, as we developmentally kind of finish out, over time, most adults tend to move into what that question Larry asked earlier, right? That ambivert kind of middle. Most people move towards the middle. I have a friend who's super introverted, and I remember when COVID hit, she said, I feel like introversion's my superpower right now. This isn't hard for me, right? What I would say is if there are situations that require you to kind of push them against their natural bent, give them the tools, right? So talking to them about it, giving them the options, right? You can come sit by me if you're feeling overwhelmed at the party. You don't have to play, not forcing them to play the game if they don't want to play the game, right? There's still ways you can accommodate that. You want to help kids learn how to manage their emotions and their thoughts. Years ago, when I was really young, not married yet, my roommate and I had a friend over to the apartment, and that friend had a little son, and so we put on the Little Mermaid in the background for the son to watch so the adults could talk. And we're watching, and that part when Ursula comes out of the water, she's scary as heck, right? She comes out of the water, and the kid's he's probably 2, and he's his eyes got so big, and he's like, Mommy, that part's coming. And she looked at him and said, okay, would you like me to fast forward it? Would you like to hold Mommy's hand? Or would you like to look at Mommy during that part? Or do you want me to turn the movie off, right? She gave him several options. And then he's like, I'll just look at you during that part, Mommy, right? He was still scared. But what did she teach him? Anxiety and fear, you don't have to be terrified of it. You can learn how to manage it. And here's some options of how you can manage it. And probably these are things that you guys have naturally done with your kids, right? It's okay. If you feel scared, that's okay. Sometimes you might be if you feel scared, that's okay. Let me start the rosary with you and you can finish it on your own. What I would say is we just want to show that we're responding to the need and the individuality. That helps. Okay, we're going to move on to T, thoughts. So Philippians 4:8 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there's any excellence and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So in the fall, right, original sin, it affected our bodies. Our bodies now get sick and decay. It affected our intellect, our mind, right, our thoughts. It affected our emotions. It affected our spiritual relationships, right? The fall affects all of it. So we can be off in our thoughts. And some of therapy is often helping people with where their thoughts get off track. So I'm going to ask, does someone have the time really quick? I just want to make sure I'm not getting too far off. 47. Okay, I'm going to skip my example and keep plowing through. Depression and anxiety are the most common mental health diagnoses. That's no shocker. There's other ones, but those are the most common. Both of them often are self-reinforcing, right? You don't feel good, you don't feel like going out of your house, you don't feel like seeing people, then you feel worse because you don't do any of that. Or you don't feel like getting up and taking a shower, getting out of your pajamas. Well, we all know if we don't take a shower and sit around in our pajamas, we feel worse. But they often have something we call cognitive distortions. Okay? Cognitive distortions are common ways that our thinking can get off track. All or nothing thinking. If I don't get 100% on the exam, I'm a total failure. Mind reading. She didn't give me the sign of peace at Mass. She hates me. Okay? Overgeneralization. My future is ruined because I didn't make this one sale. Okay? Catastrophizing. I had a friend do this once. I remember she called me up right after college. She was moving to another city, and she was like so wound up and hysterical. And I'm like, what's wrong? I looked at 2 apartments today, and I don't know which one I should get. One costs $600, and one costs $610 a month. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, she was in a frenzy, right? She was catastrophizing something that was really minor.
Which one did she choose?
I don't remember now. I'm too old to remember. It was a long time ago. Emotional reasoning, right? This is common with depression. Sure, I got a good job review, but still feels like I'm a failure, right? Our thoughts can get distorted. Feelings aren't facts, but they do give us information, right? So we pay attention to those, just like we pay attention to our behaviors, what we do. The information can be helpful to have, and then when as a counselor, when we work with someone who's dealing with these cognitive distortions, what we do is provide them a framework of how to evaluate them and then how to dispute them when necessary, right? Someone tells me, with anxiety, tells me, I can't go into a big box store like Target and go all the way to the back because what if I pass out and faint? So I don't say, oh no, don't worry, that'll never happen. I say, so what if you do? Let's say you were a Target worker and you saw someone who was looking like they were about to go down. What would you do? I'd probably offer them a chair. I'd see if they were okay. Okay, and if they did faint, what would you do? Well, I'd call 911, right? Like, we talk through it. And then we talk through, like, okay, this wouldn't kill you. It might be really uncomfortable. And then we work on going to a Target and going all the way to the back, right? Like, that is what we do when we're working with people. So I'm going to pull it over to H here real quick, and then that'll give us a chance if there's any other questions. H is for help. How do you know when it's time to get professional help? Okay. As Father said earlier, and I reinforced it, there may be times where something has happened to us in the past. If you've been through abuse or trauma, or you know someone, lots of people get married to someone and don't really. Let me say this. Lots of counselors have 10 to 15 sessions before finally someone says, oh, by the way, I was abused when I was a kid by so-and-so. And you're like, oh, that would have been helpful to know from the get-go, right? It takes a long time for that to come out sometimes. But when there's some kind of unresolved trauma from the past, that will often worm its way out in different ways in life and relationships. That's a great time to go get help. Jesus Christ wants us to be free. He does not want people to be carrying around those wounds and burdens and struggling with them. So get help if that's going on. Sometimes there's a current loss, right? A good friend of mine was widowed very suddenly. Wife was killed in a tragic car accident. He struggled for a while until finally a bunch of us were like, go talk to a counselor, right? He needed a place to go in and talk about all that and the trauma of it, what he saw when he went to the hospital and saw her battered and, really awful stuff. Maybe you're struggling in your relationship, okay? People wait till it's really dire. When your check engine light comes on in your car and you drive to the mechanic later that day, you might get great news, like I did one time where he ran the little code thing and he's like, oh, your gas cap's just not screwed on tight enough. That was literally what was the problem, why my check engine light came on, okay? If you drive another 30,000 miles with that check engine light on, then by the time you go to the mechanic, it's not going to be so cheap or inexpensive. Your car might be in the shop a couple weeks. Same thing is true for counseling. It's dreadful when someone comes in for couples counseling, like, if this doesn't work, we're getting divorced. And you're like, Well, no pressure there, right? No pressure. But the reverse, I will say there's a great trend. I will say this, among people of faith, there's a wonderful trend where many young adult Catholics are actually like, I know there's some things I'm doing that are dysfunctional. I want to work on them now before I get married. I had a young couple that I work with that called me up and said, we just got married, we're not having any trouble, but we want to avoid trouble in the future. Can we work with you and learn some tools and skills? Absolutely, right? It's good to go in if you think you need help. And here's what I would say. You go in sooner, maybe you only need 6, 8 sessions. I've had people that need, 5, 6 sessions. They just need to talk something through, get an outside perspective, get some input, and they're done. I have people who wait years and years, and then they're talking about a couple years of counseling to work through what's happened all the time. And either one's okay. Come when you come, but learn that you can take care of yourself sooner. With kids, what I would say, one is you sometimes have to offer it more than once to kids, right? If you have a teenager that might use some support, you kind of say something like, hey, in the past when I've had some difficulties, I've talked to a counselor before. I know people who have. I know that can sometimes help. If that's something you want, I'll help you get that set up, right? You can offer loosely.
I just wanted to interject something because I'm from the older generation.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about it.
Right.
Wasn't necessarily as acceptable as, like you're saying, the younger generation now.
Right.
Comes in and they want to look at it, they want to examine it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a book that I saw years ago called The Artist's Way. It was really to help writers with blocks for
Mm-hmm.
writing. And the idea was to journal 3 pages every day upon awakening, and not put any grammar or spelling or anything, and just trash it after it was done, just 3 pages.
Mm-hmm.
And I found, and I'm an extrovert and a big talker, but you asked me to go talk about it. I'm from that generation that this is private, this is whatever. So I found journaling to be very free.
Absolutely.
And not only that, the idea that I could trash it, throw it away.
Yep.
Got it off your
Yep.
chest. The little worry dolls that they used to,
Yeah.
give them your worries, put them to bed in Peru, and go to sleep, turn them over, like kind of prayers.
Yeah.
And I found out each day that I did that without realizing that by the end of the 3rd day, I had turned
You
them
worked
all
some
into
stuff
a
out.
prayer,
Yeah. Yeah.
into a prayer.
I love it.
And-
Thank
and-
you.
And that's just something I wanted to share.
Yeah.
because
Thank you.
It might be a springboard for.
Absolutely. And lots of counselors are going to have you write because there is something about the brain to hand to emotion writing connection for us. One last thing I want to say, we're out of time. Find a faith-based counselor, especially if you're going to have your kids go in for counseling. Do not send your kids to a counselor unless you know where they are coming from with regard to faith. Some counseling out there is completely contrary to the faith. CatholicTherapist.com is a place you can find a faith-based counselor. The diocese has a referral list, which you can get referrals from your priest, your parish priest. But find a faith-based counselor, interview a few people, ask a few questions, right? I weave the faith in all the time. I pray with my clients as the session starts. I tell them things like, how about if you go to confession? How about if you go to adoration, right? There is great power in the sacraments, and I'm going to encourage people to visit them and utilize them. So find a faith-based counselor. Thank you. I know I talked a lot. Thank you for your participation and input.